الله بالخير. قطعا خارطة الانقلابات من مالي إلى بوركينا فاسو فالنيجر والغابون تكشف أن الصحوة الشعبية الأفريقية باتت وتيرتها متسارعة على إيقاع صعود نظام عالمي جديد متعدد الأقطاب. النهضة الأفريقية وسيلة لتنمية أفريقيا، مستند يسلط الضوء على حلم ومقاربة للرئيس الجنوب أفريقي السابق تابو مبيكي. هل نهضت أفريقيا من سباتها لتستعيد موقعها الطبيعي كشريك أساسي في النظام العالمي الجديد والمتعدد الأقطاب؟ لماذا تتسارع وتيرة الانقلابات في القارة السمراء؟ وهل فشلت السياسة الأمريكية في فهم التغييرات المتلاحقة في القارة الأفريقية؟ ما الذي يقوض هيمنة النفوذ الأمريكي في غرب أفريقيا؟ كيف تساهم الصين في التنمية المستدامة لأفريقيا؟ وهل يغير الشباب الأفريقي موقع القارة الجيوسياسي؟ ومع تقدم النفوذ الروسي، هل باتت فرنسا مهددة في مستعمراتها القديمة الجديدة؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر عن مستقبل القارة الأفريقية في ظل انبلاج عالم متعدد الأقطاب مع الأستاذ فرانكلين نيامسي، الكاتب الكاميروني ومن رواد حركة وحدة أفريقيا في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. Professor Franklin Nyamsi, Pan-Africanist Cameroonian author and president of the African Freedoms Institute. Professor Nyamsi, salam and welcome to Al Miadeen. This is The Proximate Aspect. I'm Zainab Al-Safar. Pure pleasure to have you, sir.
Thank you. I'm very, very happy to discover your channel, and I salute all the viewers of Al Miadeen.
Most welcome. Always a pleasure to have you, sir. Well, according to our reference, the African Renaissance, a vehicle for Africa development, the concept of African Renaissance was articulated by Sheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian, anthropologist, and politician who studied the human race's origins and pre-colonial African culture. Diop believed that the African people shall overcome the challenges confronting the continent and achieve cultural, scientific, and economic renewal. Sir, Professor Nyamsi, what are your impressions on how can the African Renaissance activate, promote, and strengthen self-determination, unity, identity, development, and transformation of the whole continent?
Thank you. African people today have four main struggles to reach the goal Professor Sheikh Anta Diop defined in his thought and in his wonderful books and conferences through the world when he was alive. The first goal for Africa is to fight against military, foreign, colonial, neo-colonial, and imperialist occupation. The second goal is for Africans today to fight against economical and monetary domination coming from the former colonial, neo-colonial, imperialist rulers of Africa. The third goal is to fight for African people's sovereignty, so that the African people will be the one who will choose their own leaders by clear and very fair electoral processes. And there is a fourth goal, is that the African people must renew African economical, cultural, social, political institution in the African multimillenary tradition, which is a tradition coming from the very ancient Africa, and particularly the Negro-African Kemet called Egypt, that Professor Sheikh Anta Diop studied very deeply. It is a tradition rooted on one concept called Maat, and that concept means truth, justice, and solidarity as the pillars of the African world. We have to renew all African institutions through these four struggle goals.
Right. The dream of former South African President Thabo Mbeki was, however, not realized due to the influence exerted by the West on other states in Africa. Today, in 2023, it marks 60 years since the founding of the Organization of African Unity. In your perspective, sir, as an observer and as an author of at least 25 books about Africa, what has failed and what has succeeded? How much of the vision of the founding fathers has been realized?
In fact, Africa has been led on a false competition, on a false line. And the line was Africa has to realize an economical system with growth as the main goal of that system, economical growth. And Africa has to realize a political system with democracy as the goal. But in fact, in African tradition, those two goals are not Africans at all. They are not rooted in African tradition. For us, economy is organized to help vulnerable people, to help all the people not to fall in poverty, not to fall in total, suffering. For us in Africa, in African tradition, the aim, the goal of politics is not, in fact, just to realize the will of the majority. It is to ensure everywhere justice, truth, and solidarity in the relations between human beings, the relation between humanity and the nature, and the relation between humanity and the creator. In Africa, we believe that the spirit is superior to matter, and that all the society must be organized in recognizing that no human being has created itself, and humanity is not an auto-created, auto-created space. So we began the work of Africa in the path of freedom with false goals given by Westerners, given by the Western thought.
Imposed by Westerners upon the African people. That's very true.
Yes.
Yes, because the African people were often dismissed by, for example, US diplomats as backward, as incapable, and as inferior. Such thinking and American policy have largely failed to understand the rapid changes taking place swiftly across the African continent. How did, Dr. Niamsi, the US policy towards Africa create avenues for China and Russia to step in, to move into the Sahel region and East Africa?
You have to look in the deep history of Africa, and you will see that Africa has been facing three challenges. The first challenge was in the 17th century, slavery, massive slavery, what we called the Negro trade. And that Negro trade got in Europe and in America. And that Negro trade, it was the condition of Western capitalism growth. That is the first tragedy of Africa. The second tragedy of Africa is colonial aggression. From the 18th century to the 20th century, Africa was facing Western armies, and in Berlin, Africa was shared without Africans. So, in fact, through that slave trade and that colonial how can I say, aggression. They also denied that Africa has a tradition, Africa has a culture, Africa has an autonomous process of thinking, of creating its institution and culture.
Africa has a spirit too. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. American policy is based in Africa on that racism coming from the slave trade, the Negro trade. It is based on colonialism coming from the domination of Western powers on Africa. And they have never minded that. In fact, Africa has not accepted or recognized as goals of civilization, economical growth and democracy. We need solidarity, justice, equity in everything, and we need harmony between humanity and the nature, and acknowledgement of the fact that the human beings is in fact created and that nature has not created itself.
True.
This is the African vision, and we have to reorganize our economics, our politics, our society with that traditional view.
Exactly. But my question that for example, recent coups in Africa appear to have put the West on the defensive in parts of the continent, with the US trying to maintain its footprint, its stronghold in the continent. Is the US influence waning, diminishing in West Africa and Africa as a whole at a time when rivals, Russia and China, are expanding links and presence?
Absolutely. That influence is diminishing. Why? Because the influence of America and of all Western powers is based on falsehood concerning African culture and history. It is based on the denegation of African humanity as able to create its own meaning in the world. But Russia and China and all other powers helped Africa in a very crucial period, which was the period of the anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist struggle through the 20th century. So when Africa is renewing its relation with its roots, Africa acknowledges that China, Russia, and many other countries of the global South are better partners than America or Western powers because they recognize the right to build its own future of the Africans.
True. China's serious advancement, Professor Niamsi, in the continent began at the Bandung Conference in 1955, where its leaders aligned themselves with African nationalists. And today, China's premier, for example, makes frequent visits to Africa, while the country invests billions of dollars in the region on infrastructure and other projects. How does China contribute to Africa's sustainable development and why it matters? Briefly, if I may.
China has no responsibility in the sustainability of African development. This is the responsibility of Africa.
True.
What Africans want today is a partnership of winning, winner, with all the powers of the world. In fact, the responsibility of sustainable development is an African one. It is not the responsibility of Chinese or Russian or American to develop and to make a sustainable development in Africa. That is how and why Africans understand better the way of China to come. China comes with pragmatical, realistic approach, and they do with Africans only what Africans want them to do with them.
Now, Antony Blinken, on his first trip to Africa as Secretary of State, said that Africa, and I'm quoting him, that Africa will shape the future of the world, not just the future of the African people. So Africa is poised to become one of the world's most important economic regions. Why and how?
In fact, in Mr. Blinken's affirmation, there is something that is particularly wrong. Africa is not the future of the world. The world is our common world. Africa, Asia, Europe, America, everybody has the right to be of the future of the world. By saying that Africa is the future of the world, Mr. Blinken implies that they will do everything to keep their power, their influence on Africa, so that through Africa, they will remain hegemonical on all the world. And this is what we cannot accept in that vision. Africa is the future of Africans, and the world is the future of all the sons of this earth.
Excellent.
That is why, in fact.
True, true. Also, Africa, well, it is a continent of young people, energized, innovative, hungry for jobs and opportunity. By the year 2025, more than half the population of Africa will be under age 25. By the year 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. Whereas industrialized nations are worried, sir, about declining birth rates, African youths are increasingly taking an active role in shaping their future. Why do you reckon, Professor Niamsi, Africa's youth hold the key to its development potential?
In Africa, we still have 30,000 kilometers square of space. And we have a population which is under the space we have. So the Western vision that Africa is overpopulated is absolutely wrong. And it is a way to stop African initiative and spontaneity in building its own future. We believe that Africa will be able to fulfill the challenges if we put all our energy in educating our youth, so that that youth will be able to understand science, technology, and keep the roots of our tradition, so that our identity will not be lost when we will be in the competition of the world. Education, for me, is the root of the future of Africa, for Africans.
Right. Dysfunction, chaos, troubled, unstable, fractured. This is the West MSM, mainstream media. They have been firing out these terms on many African states. How does the disinformation on African countries serve the West global hegemony? When will the world, sir, call out these discrepancies in how Africans are treated in all of our developing countries? How is it Africa has the resources but cannot use them to become developed?
It is very clear that the same people who describe Africa like a disaster continent, a continent of disaster, are of many of those countries who are responsible for centuries now of the disaster of Africa. I repeat, slave trade, colonization, neo-colonization, imperialism, support to dictatorships in Africa are the root, the key reasons why Africa is not able today to feed its own population, to heal its own population, and to defend it against the global changes, defend it against ecological changes, and so on. So what we have to do is to fight at the same time for security sovereignty, for economical sovereignty, for political sovereignty, and spiritual, cultural sovereignty, to change the image, the conception, the vision of Africa for Africans themselves. And for the non-African people, we have to clearly free Africa from neo-colonial links, free Africa in itself, because in the African people, those traumatisms have led something like a kind of pessimism about the present and the future. We have to heal all those souls by a good education.
Right. Do African leaders today, sir, see Russia in a different prism in comparison to Western powers, particularly France?
The difference is that in the African memory, when Africa was fighting against colonialism, colonialism was assumed by the West. It was France, it was United Kingdom, Belgium, Italy, Germany, and so on. And it was Russia and China that helped African anti-colonialist movement to fight. So we Africans are very, very acknowledging about that fact. Secondly, Russia has no pretension to teach democracy or human rights to Africans. They have understood that an Africa under Western domination will be an Africa used to confront and challenge Russia and China. That is why they are helping African fight against Western hegemony. But in fact, for Africans, the true and the key solution is that we shall be able to produce our own vision, our own growth, our own prosperity in an autonomous endogenous process. And this is why we need alliances that help us to emancipate ourselves, and we need to cut all the tie, all the relations that maintain us in alienation.
True. In talking about alliances, how does the BRICS expansion place Africa in its rightful position within the global emerging multipolar order and the global south?
The BRICS are very interesting for Africans because they open a window for direct economical, direct social and cultural exchanges. And particularly, the BRICS help African people to get out the currency domination of dollar, the currency domination of euro, of franc CFA. Now it is possible through cryptocurrencies. It is possible through national currency to build economical bilateral relation with many countries of the world without the intermediation of the West. So the BRICS is a new and open market where African genius can absolutely play.
True. The African Renaissance is a philosophical and political movement to end the violence, elitism, corruption and poverty believed to plague the African continent and to replace them with a more just and equitable order. The world acknowledge that Africa is the cradle of humanity. How can this looted continent re-emerge as a significant partner in drawing the contours of the new world order? What is a multipolar world in terms of freedom of Africa, and what about reparations?
A multipolar world for Africans today means the possibility for them to be politically sovereign, to be economically sovereign, notably through the mastery of their own currencies, to be culturally sovereign by renewing the concept of African tradition in African politics, economics, African technology and science. And we need to enter in direct negotiations with all world powers without any kind of intermediation of former colonial or imperialist power. That is the four main goals I've given at the beginning of this talk. We have to fulfill those goals at the same time. Mm-hmm. There is no priority. Everything has to be done at the same time with one very important goal, which is give the African people its dignity back.
Mm-hmm. What about reparations?
The reparations have to be realized in that process of African political sovereignty. I believe that the African debt, for example, the African debt with the IMF, with the World Bank, with America and Europe, is nothing compared to what African trial will reveal about what the West has to pay to Africa for the Negro trade, what the West has to pay for colonial massacres, crime against African humanity, what the West has to pay for what happened just only in this 20th or 21st centuries against Africa. So we will have a balance after those trials that will come when any African country will be free. We will have trials. We will evaluate clearly what the West has to pay, what the colonial and imperialist power have to pay, and we will compare it to the debt. We'll do a subtraction, and then for sure they will have a lot to pay. Those who will not pay will lose their advantages in Africa.
Sure. Professor Franklin Niamsi, Pan-Africanist Cameroonian author, thank you very much, sir, for your eye-opening perspective and views. Always a pleasure to have you, sir.
Thank you. It was a pleasure also.
Most welcome. لقد حاولت أفريقيا فيما بعد الاستعمار السير على إيقاع طبولها الخاصة بينما يجري التلاعب بها من قبل قوى أجنبية أخرى وبأقنعة مختلفة. إن أنظمة الحكم والسياسة في أفريقيا تحتاج بحسب مراقبين إلى الخضوع لتحولات جذرية في مجالات الوحدة القارية والوحدة داخل أفريقيا وفيما بينها، ولعل أفريقيا بحاجة ماسة إلى أجندة إيديولوجية موحدة للتقدم تأخذ بعين الاعتبار ثرواتها الغنية وتقدم شعبها وثقافته وتميزه. ويمكن لقارة أفريقيا الآن أن تقف مجتمعة وقوية على قدم المساواة مع بقية العالم، وأن يكون صوتها مسموعا ومؤثرا، وأن تؤدي دورا حاسما في تحقيق مهمة العثور على نفسها وعلى روحها وتحقيق إمكاناتها الكاملة على المسرح العالمي. ولكن قد يرى البعض أن صوت أفريقيا لن يؤخذ على محمل الجد في الوقت الحالي، وسيظل مستقبلها ودورها في النظام العالمي المتعدد الأقطاب ضعيفا جدا ومليئا بالمشاكل، إلا إذا غيرت اتجاهها على نحو جذري في نواح كثيرة. من كل الميادين سلاما وتحية، في أمان الله.